I ngā mana, i ngā reo, i ngā karangatanga maha, tēnei te reo karamihi kia koutou, te hunga kua rauika, e iri māro nei te manawa ki te kai a te rangatira, arā ko te kōrero, ko te mātauranga. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai ki tēnei taumata kōrero. E ngā mate o te wā haere, haere i te au kukume, i te au roroa, i te au hirere, e hirere atu ana ki te pō uriuri, ki te pō tangotango, ki te pō e ngā ai te moi. Haere, haere, e oki. Ke hoki mai anō ki ngā pūpā whakaea, wawata o te hunga kōrero, ono numi mā, ororoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Me mihi ka tika ki o tātou pū kōrero o te wānei, arā ko Veronica Tawhai, koutou ko Rachel Dibble, ko Jarrod Telford hoki. Tēnā koutou, nau mai, whakatau mai. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think this is the last webinar of the day for the Treaty-Based Futures and Anti-Racism Symposium, and this particular webinar, which is Teaching Te Tiriti, Decolonisation and Constitutional Transformation, with our esteemed guests, Veronica Tawhai, Rachel Dibble and Jarrod Telford. I'll start with a karakia and then introductions will take place and a bit of housekeeping. Nō reira, me karakia tātou. Wairea, wairea te ara takatū. Wairea te hinengaro, te tinana, te wairua, te ngākau, kia māhia, kia wātea. Wairea te rangi e tui honei, te papa e takoto nei. Te hunga e hui hui mai nei. Kia tira marangi, kia tira manuku, kia tau te rangi Māori e. Ki roto ki tēnā o tātou. Turuturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, tīna. Haumie, huie, taiki. Tēnā koutou. Ko wai tēnei, ko Rhonda Paku ahau, he uri no nai tūhoi, Ngāti Rua Pani, Ngāti Kahungunu o te Wairoa, rongo whakaata, me taimi moriori. My name is Rhonda Paku and I'm facilitating this webinar. I'm of tūhoi, rongo whakaata, Ngāti Rua Pani, Ngāti Kahungunu and moriori descent. And I'm pleased to join you this afternoon with 3 guest speakers who will be speaking on this panel about teaching Te Tiriti, decolonisation and constitutional transformation. So just making sure you're all in the right webinar. Welcome. Welcome everybody. I know some of you have joined us from a long way away and I'm sure you'll get a lot of value and benefit from this conversation. A little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. A reminder, as you can see, a slide here about our community code. So the days together have been carefully guided and supported by the community code, which you can see there. I won't read them all out to you, but this is about making sure we are respectful, that this is a mana enhancing forum, and that people provide space and take space when appropriate, and that we are articulating our views with consideration. Also reminding people that you can interact with each other via the chat, and you can also ask questions down below on your screen. There's a Q&A function there. Pop your questions in there. We do have some moderators and I'll be monitoring the questions as they come in and posing those to our panel as time permits. Letting you know too that our moderators are there to help us run this webinar smoothly. And so we can get the most benefit out of the next wee while. We are down for 2 hours. We might need to take a break at about 4:30. That'll be for 5 minutes and then we'll rejoin again and go for as long as our conversations are required to keep going. Otherwise, sit back and be prepared to listen. We've got, as I said, we've got 3 speakers on our panel today, and before I hand the mic over to each of them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what's brought them into the space and how long they've been teaching, I'd just like to say that it's a pleasure to be here sitting with fellow members of a group that we all belong to, which is Te Tiriti Educators, and that's a national educators forum where we each take teaching Te Tiriti and constitutional transformation very seriously, and we take it out to the public, and we share views, and we're just helping to lift awareness and understanding about Te Tiriti and about the opportunity for Aotearoa New Zealand to be able to transform itself into something where everyone can thrive. So I'd just like to hand over first to the first of our three speakers, and that's to Rachel, who you can see is beautifully dressed in glittery. Rachel is a glittery personality and come appropriately attired. Tēnā koe, Rachel, kei a koe.
Oh, kia ora koutou. So firstly, mihi ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohi, kai tahu ka te māmau waitaha rabu ai hoki. I am, so, ko taranaki me pihanga ngā maunga, ko waingongoro me tō kānu ngā awa, ko Aotea me te arawa ngā waka, ko turi rawa ko tama te kāpua ngā rangatira, ko Ngāti Ruanui ngā ruahine me Ngāti Telford re tō ngā iwi, ko o kahu inuwai me Ngāti Karawia ngā hapu, ko Aotearoa me tō kānu ngā marae, and ko Haddon rawa ko wakarau ngā whānau, ko Rachel Dibble aho. So I'm teaching here in this today sunny space of Ōtepoti. It's not always sunny, but it is today. And I've been teaching in a tertiary institution, Otago Polytechnic, for about 10 years, but I had some tautoko from mana whenua here in which to align my kōrero of Taranaki into the stories of mana whenua place. So I've been teaching in the Bachelor of Social Services and have done a little bit of teaching in different certificates and different bachelors. Te Tiriti is my passion and people are my future. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe. Thank you so much, Rachel. Jarrod, kei a koe te wā?
Tēnā tātou, i te tuatahi mehi ki a koe, Rhonda, te kaikarakia mo te rā, i tu whakatuwhera tō tātou nei hui. Kia koutou mā hoki I rumene mai kei raro I tēnei momo kaupapa o te rā. Nei rata mihi kawana kia koutou hoki. Ko wai tēnei, he uri a hau o te tai rāwhiti. Ngāti Porou, te whakatōhea, te aitanga māhaki hoki. Ko Jarrod Telford tōku ingoa, he paumatua hau mo te whare o Downer. So my name's Jarrod Telford, and I work as the paumatua for a major, what we call a tier 1 infrastructure company called Downer. And I get my Pākehā name from my dad, who's from Dannevirke, but mum is from a place called Te Karaka on the up there on the east coast inland from Gizzy. So I started, I actually was a student of a wee while ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I found out when I was studying under her that I was reasonably good at doing treaty and policy. And she says, hey, would you like to try come and hang out with these treaty educators, if you know what I mean? And so I was like, yep, I'll give that a crack. And it just coincided with my role change at my company. And so I ended up joining Ronnie's crew, but also leading a lot of our treaty discussions and wānanga within the infrastructure space. So only relatively new, a bit of a greenhorn really in the space, about 6 years of educating, and really lucky that I work for a major corporate who are really invested in making sure that everybody has the knowledge to engage Māori properly in this space. So that's enough from me. I think I've got a 5-minute time limit, and Ronnie usually takes up most of the space, so I'll chuck that ako back over. So tēnā tātou I te whare.
Tēnā koe, Jarrod. Ka pai. All right, kei a koe, Ronnie.
Kia ora, brother, kia ora tātou. Ko hukirangi te maunga, ko waipu te awa, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, ko te papatipu o oi pohatu te whenua, ko Veronica Tawhai taku ingoa, ko te atakura educators, taku tira. Kia ora everyone, Ronnie, Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Ui pohatu on the East Coast. On my mother's side, also Irish and English, beaming into you today from the beautiful lands of Rangitani iwi, so mihi ana kia Rangitani, Ngāti Kauwhata, e Ngāti Raukawa ki te tonga. That are in the rohe here. Wonderful to be here. Been teaching Te Tiriti for a wee while, but just to acknowledge our beautiful mentored many, but Mona Jackson, met him when we were fairly young. He had me then teaching short Te Tiriti things a few years after across a range of areas back in mine and Rachel's political student activist days. Then also just give big mihi to Bob Yonke from Waipiro Bay, who also then employed me to teach the Māori politics and policy stream at Te Pūtaiatoi, School of Māori Studies at Mass University, where Te Tiriti was one of the papers I taught. And it's Bob that also then gave me space and time to be able to then start teaching into community. So now very happy, been a few years now, geez, maybe over 10, running, working part-time as a Te Tiriti educator for what we ended up calling Te Atakura educators. So very happy to be here, everyone. Yous that are all listening in, these are 3 stellar other Te Tiriti educators. As said, we're going to be hearing from Rachel and Jarrod, but also, be encouraging Rhonda to jump on in there. But yeah, really happy to be here. Ngā mihi kia koutou Heather K. Ma, o te whakariti tēnei kaupapa.
Ai, tēnā koe. O kia ora koutou. And actually, as Ronnie was saying, I'm also part of Te Atakura Educators, and under Ronnie have trained with a group of colleagues and I that used to work together in the public service, where we delivered to some 500 plus public servants in the last few years, in recent years. So it's a great pleasure to bring us all here together to share some insights and to think about some of the things that make our praxis and our pedagogy successful, and how we can extend some of the learning opportunities to tangata tiriti and help with the I guess really in terms of the times that we sit in, to help us work in a positive space and bring some alignment back to the things that will help centre a future around Te Tiriti. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. As you heard too there, I just wanted to touch on the fact that we all come from quite diverse backgrounds, and this is why it's just so important to have different perspectives, not only from an academic perspective, but also from a space where it's very much on the ground, working with our tangata tiriti and tangata whenua, hands-on, making sense of how we can actually apply the lessons and the learnings from our tipuna and that speak through Te Tiriti still today, as well as he whakaputanga and more recently things like our tribunal claims and Mātika Mai. So without further ado, I'd really like to get straight into some of the conversations. As educators, they are obviously primed to do to say quite a lot. So I'm going to be keeping a close eye on them, just so you know, and making sure that we share equal time, giving time and space to each other. But I'm going to throw out a few questions, and I'll start with you, Rachel. Can you just talk to us a little bit, please, around what learners' responses have been to the kaupapa of shared authority, co-governance, kāwanatanga, tino rangatiratanga?
Yeah, kia ora. I think it's worth mentioning for me how I work in a tertiary setting. So the learning that they have to do is part of a qualification that goes over 3 years. So I've got the really beautiful opportunity to make sure that there is a length of time that learners can reflect in their understanding of these concepts, or something that is very true to the tangata whenua students in the room. So how do they respond? It is all woven into how the story comes to them, where they sit in relation to te tiriti, where they sit in relation to not knowing about he whakaputanga prior to coming into the class, where they sit in location to the whenua that they are acknowledging. So, if that is woven through in a way that embraces their lived experience and acknowledges where they have come from, I generally see that there isn't too much difficulty with understanding the concept of co-governance. it becomes logical when you take the time to see how it can be and what kind of future we have in front of us using the kōrero of co-governance, tino rangatiratanga, not just as abstract concepts, but looking at it in terms of, if we're working with tangata whenua, what does it mean if their reality has been different to your reality? So yeah, I think generally it's been excellent for the learners to think about the world around them, and also we use kōrero of what was that like for your parents? What would that have been like for your caregivers who are older than you? You know, aunties, uncles, anyone, you know, flatmates, partners. So those kind of kōrero, really connecting in with that, I guess the relationship that they have with people around them and how much they are having an opportunity to learn right now about the concepts that, you know, they're seeing this year, certainly in the last few years, a conversation that is happening more in the, I guess, some of the media that is available to us. Yeah.
Kia ora kapai. Before I come to you, Jarrod, I just did want to extend a little bit, Rachel, and give Ronnie and Jarrod a bit of time to think about it too, because I know you've been at Otago for some 10 years now. What has been the most noticeable change that you've noticed in learners' responses?
The noticeable change would be probably since 2020 is that a rise in the awareness of how systemic racism can be seen. So with some of the legislative changes in the recent times, it's more in the news, or there are people talking about it on social media that offer really excellent little snippets that people can respond to. So it's opened up the kōrero more. And while that might, you know, be uncomfortable at times, what is that like? What I've seen is students willing, or learners willing, to engage in that conversation. And sometimes it's hard, but sometimes it's, well, most of the time, it's great conversation to have. Yeah.
I'm sure. Kāre kore. Ka pai. Thanks so much, Rachel, for warming up the platform for us. Jarrod Telford, what have you noticed have been learners' responses to kaupapa such as shared authority and tino rangatiratanga, co-governance, etc.?
It's probably it's probably important for me to tell everyone what kind of participants or tauira that I have in the akomanga. So I work in an engineering space, so I have a lot of engineers, and they are very solutions focused. So quite often the conversation doesn't sit around the moral point or dilemma or whatever around co-governance and tino rangatiratanga. Because they're so solutions focused, they're a bit more like, well, how do we make this work? You know, how do we make this work in this project? Like, oh, this is new. So it's it can be quite a dynamic sort of a space to work in, because they immediately jump to, oh, well, this is going to happen. So then how do we make it work? Which is quite a nice sort of a space to be in, even despite what the government narrative is at the moment. You know, they're still focused on that outcome. You know, obviously we're big in water, and before the last election, co-governance was a really big thing. So yeah, like I say, that our people weren't so much focused on oh, we shouldn't be doing this, or that's not fair, or I'm not having to convince people, if you know what I mean. It's more like they frame out, well, actually, how do we make this work? How do we make sure that an infrastructure spend is getting good social outcomes for Māori and for the community? So yeah, a little bit different. I don't have to spend a lot of time framing everything up, if you like. However, you still get a lot of people that get a lot of aha moments when you start breaking down what tino rangatiratanga is, and you know, just all, and he wakaputanga, and that actually Māori have these rights before the treaty is signed, and it's just an affirmation of them. Actually, the treaty is for, you know, tauiwi and da 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 da. So you have a lot of aha light bulb moments, if you know what I mean, and it really grounds the learners in actually, I have a responsibility here when it comes to Māori having mana motu hake and tino rangatiratanga, and actually how am I an enabler of that? So yeah, really lucky in my space, and I don't have to fight either a narrative coming out of the institution. They're like, you frame it up, you run with it. So yeah, it's quite a bit different, I'd imagine, to being in a tertiary space.
Kia ora, that's really an interesting insight, because as you say, they're hands-on, very focused audience, and they're solutions focused, which I guess if you turn up with a Gantt chart and it says this is how it can go, then they will potentially adopt it.
Pretty
After
much,
it's done there. Although I do imagine in the time that you've been doing this work over the last 6 years that there has probably been a little bit of change as well. So do you want to speak to how the responses are today as opposed to when you first started?
Yeah, I think maybe it's to do a little bit more with our aging workforce. So when we first started running these, our workforce, we have an aging workforce. I see Māori as being the key to, helping our workforce with those skilled sort of roles and things like that. And that's part of what I do in my role. But so you have an older Pākehā male workforce, and they come in with some pretty set views on Māori, and some pretty, I had a laugh with Ronnie and Rachel the other day when one of the biggest discussions that we have is, didn't you guys eat the moriori? So you have this really old school mindset about who Māori are, but what I've noticed in the last 7 or 8 years is those people are retiring and they're moving on, and we're getting this younger generation of leader and engineer come through, and they're a lot more open. They have a lot of a softer heart towards Māori, if you know what I mean. So they're very they have kids at home that are going, Dad, Mum, you have to learn how to say Māori names properly, and we're going to do a karakia kai. And so there's this slight sort of generational shift, if you know what I mean. And I think in terms of an organisation, we've matured in our journey. At first it was like, we don't want to have a treaty statement, or we want to stay away, it's too politically edgy. Now they're like, no, we're on the journey. We're, tōtika te haere, we're on that journey, and actually if we want to be seen as authentic, let's make that statement. Let's not hover over here in the sit on the fence kind of style. It's like, so yeah, I've seen a maturing, I suppose, in terms of that as a company.
You're that shifting demographic in your workspace is certainly going to have it leave an impression, as well as leave space for others to come in and share their own influence. Thank you for that. So many questions come out of it, but I think it's going to come in with the next question that I want to ask you, or I'll let Ronnie have a turn at this one. Learners' responses. Over to you, Ronnie.
Right. Okay, firstly, just want to say absolutely fantastic answers, Rachel and Jarrod, and observations there, Kuka. I love both of those in terms of, I think that's really clever what you do, Rachel, in terms of getting people to connect to place and knowing, right, yeah, I'm somewhere, as in I'm on the home of someone. And that's such a clever way, my friend, to be able to then open up those discussions about, well, what does it actually mean to be in the same space, to be sharing space? It's just such a beautiful entrance into then a shared authority discussion. Same with you, brother Jarrod. That's exactly what I've noted as well amongst the younger generation. Sort of, I don't know if they're still using the word woke kids, are they? I don't know. But anyway, you know what I'm saying? In terms of younger ones that are definitely a lot more aware, but also definitely a lot more open in terms of, right, yep, this is what is the right or the just thing to do. And so, we just need to get on with how what that looks like, and especially keen. And I know we have a question later on about allies that we'll discuss then. Now, in terms of learner responses, I love this question because we know that one of the trickiest points with teaching about, Te Tiriti can be shared authority, the notion of there being tino rangatiratanga as something as definitely equal to, if not more important than the rights of kāwanatanga that we gave. And that when people realise the story of what kāwanatanga originally was, that huge tension about that in many ways we can argue, you know, the illegitimacy of the way that kāwanatanga is currently operating. We know from experiences where some students can start to really not lose it whānau, but this is when they go, uh-oh, you know, this is actually a lot more serious. And particularly introducing the mātike mai question, of, you know, mātike mai, that actually, you know, there's a vision for the shared authority as well, whether it's co-governance, you know, whether it's co-management in different areas, etc. And what I find is that actually we can help people calm the farm, you know, or help people just become a little bit more with the topic. And the wānanga I run is actually by showing, you know, and this has always been the case, that right from, you know, the very establishment of settler parliament in the 1850s, you know, we have our tipuna going there and making co-governance proposals. You know, we then have our own co-governance proposals in our institutions that might be new initiatives that we've started, but that's really what it's been about, you know, being able to establish institutions that then Pākehā can recognise as a way to communicate, be that our own parliaments, be that the, you know, the hanganui, you know, and all of those types of things. I find people really are able then to settle a little bit more into the idea once we go, guys, you know, actually this is a very old idea, from the very beginning old, in fact, you know, and giving people leads of the different examples that then they are able to follow. I think this is really something powerful about mātike mai. All of us that are, you know, promoters and educators about mātike mai is, you know, our clear articulation that this is just what we call it currently. Mātike mai is just our the current way that we discuss this notion of shared authority, of the rebalancing of tino rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga, which does require the restoration of tino rangatiratanga and the rolling back of kāwanatanga. And I love Heather came and, you know, your tira, the discussions they have around, well, what is actually honourable kāwanatanga. So I think the responses are fine once we actually give that historical context and that people can see, oh, actually, this is just another element of history that's been hidden from us, you know, and able to introduce then that critical thinking element of, and yes, why do we think that is whānau? You know, why is it that, you know, we're all losing it over this notion of co-governance when actually it's something that's been right there throughout the discussion. So I find that helps.
Tēnā koe, kia ora, Ronnie. I think too, like with Rachel and Jarrod, lots of questions come out of that, but I think too that the next question is going to address some of the possible questions that you all might have out there listening, and certainly a question that's come up from Catherine Delahunty. Kia ora, Catherine. It's nice to hear your voice on there in the questions. And that's around the types of teaching approaches that are most effective when you're addressing these sorts of kaupapa. So what's helping to cut through? Aside from ripping the plaster off and doing that deep education, what are the approaches that you each find are most effective when you're addressing these kinds of kaupapa? Rachel.
Yeah, kia ora. Look, one of the things that I have in my mind to talk to is our ancestors, our tipuna. I always used to start off by thinking about my kids. And also, I was really fortunate when I went to Teachers College back in the whatevers it was. There was nines in it. And I was part of the last cohort to go through Teachers College when it was a B.Ed and a Teachers College, and we had the opportunity to have a Te Tiriti workshop by Eri Hapati, via Eri Hapati Ramsden. So for me, I'd just returned from living in Japan, and then I was into this space where she said, or it was already organised that we would be in tangata whenua group and Pākehā or Tauiwi group. And so I didn't actually know about another way to teach about Te Tiriti, because that was the way that opened up to me. And it was the most, I can't even put it into words, maybe you can see my feelings. It was the best feeling ever, because I was full of grief. I was full of grief because my nana had died while I'd been overseas. And this beautiful wahine was so gentle, this with her kōrero, and she took us through the mamae. So I always remember that, and I always mihi to her in the learning, because that holding of grief and connection to or disconnection to place is so important for tangata whenua differently to Pākehā or Tawiwi. Our story is a different kind of story. We feel it in a different kind of way. So how I took that into becoming an educator was recognising, mihiing to her and also other amazing wahine that I was lucky to be mentored by. So Kyla, Dr. Professor Kyla Russell, and her whānau, and also in this space of a tertiary institution that, you know, was willing to have an opportunity to support a different way of delivery. It was always part of the bachelor's program to bring in an authentic kōrero from mana whenua. So when I started teaching, it was in the first year of the qualification. It was lonely. I remember my first class, and I was terrified to go in. I didn't know if I was going to remember everything, dates especially, names of wars and people who did war. I mean, I just was terrified. So what I needed to do was locate it to place. And for me, that was the kōrero to parihaka. And once I developed that, I felt a little bit more comfort. But that the mamae that we're talking about, the legislation, the impacts of the legislation, I felt lonely. So I felt lonely, and it was hard because it's grief every time I talk to it. So I was able to advocate and eventually have been able to teach with another person in the room this particular content in year one. So that has been, that was the impetus for my masters, you know, how many people are in the room when Te Tiriti is taught. And for me, it having a hoa haere, so mihi ki a koe Karen, me Katrina, having someone else in the room means that I can take a space or a perspective that is tangata whenua focused, and the hoa haere or the other person in the room can speak into that space. And I can't really like put it into words, except for, yeah, I've probably got lots of words knowing me, but it just, it's so much easier for me, but also it's largely, or it's more of a Pākehā, there are more Pākehā in the room as akonga. So if it's a different environment with a different amount of tangata whenua in the room, it will be a different way that I think I would want to teach. Yeah. Ka mihi.
Kia ora, gosh, we really could feel that.
You've just hit your mute button, Koka.
My apologies, everyone. Thank you so much, Rachel. I really felt that. And I think as Te Atakura educators, we often talk about making sure we have hoa haere, the concept, and actually having people travelling with you to make sure that they can help with managing space, and when we need to pull back and just let some of that grief wash over, so we can reset and then come back in, as well as offering different perspectives. So thank you for that. Also, just acknowledging too that there's still a question in there around how we actually break down that concept of shared authority to explain to our learners how it can actually work. And it's a little bit, it's still harking back to that first one around learners' responses. If either Jarrod or Ronnie want to build that into your response to question 2, which is still around what are those teaching approaches that are most effective. So over to you now, Jarrod.
Yeah, just building off the hoa haere concept, actually, I was really lucky to get to develop our workshop, if you like, with a a Pākehā woman called Debbie Kirby, who came from a tertiary background, and we made a conscious decision to try to have only a Pākehā or non-Māori audience, or just a Māori audience when we were doing our workshops, just because you have to be really cognizant of the psychological reactions and responses that you're going to get from both audiences. For Māori, that response to your history is going to be grief, or it's going to be pain, or it's going to be perhaps anger. With a non-Māori audience, there's embarrassment, sometimes there's shame, and so you have to be really mindful of that. So when I occupy the Māori space, tangata whenua, and my hoa haere she was the tangata Tiriti. So we had this had roles to play whenever we had our presentation. And at the end of the first workshop that we ever ran, I actually went back to Rhonda. She goes, "How was your first workshop?" And I said, "I think it was a bit nice." To everybody, I didn't think I ripped the band-aid off. And she goes, "No. Remember," and this is the best piece of advice that I've ever been given when it comes to delivering Te Tiriti. She said, "You have a responsibility to those learners, because you are going to take them through a journey that they are not responsible for, and it's not their fault what happens. So you can't bash them around. What we want to do is take them on that journey so that they get an understanding, and then we can build allyship across the motu." And I took that away. I was like, "Oh yeah, tika tō kōrero," and it's been a foundational piece actually on how we deliver in our workshops. So it's all about understanding. It's all about facts. Also, probably it's important to mention that we also get to deliver in the environment of our choice. So when they asked me, the company says, "Hey, we want you to run this treaty workshop and all of this kind of thing," I was like, "Oh, sweet. Well, we're going to do it at the marae." And that's non-negotiable. So we run a 2-day wānanga. Day one is, I will hold your hand and take you to the marae. So we go right around the motu, and like Rachel does, we connect everybody to place. These are the people from here. This is the whenua. We go walk the whenua, listen to their stories, make them feel safe, make it all fun. And when I was a lot younger, I used to do these hui rangatahi. So anyone on the call, they used to go to hui rangatahi under the Rautaki whakatupuranga ruamano down in Aotearoa. We used to go away every holidays and spend a week at the marae, and they were the best experiences I ever had, because they were fun. They made you feel connected, and all I did was really, really take those learnings and apply it in this new space. So day one, we take people who've never, and you got to admire their courage, because they are freaking out going to the marae. Never been to a pōwhiri, never had a hongi, and then they got to sleep on the marae, sleep in the whare communally, and the next day we deliver a pretty hard-hitting workshop. And one of the things that they are always appreciative of is that they've built connections with other people in that akomanga, because it can be pretty challenging for people when they're hearing our history, sometimes for the first time, that has been hidden in plain sight sometimes from them. So when we're talking about those sort of responses, if you like, we carefully manage those through environment, through manaakitanga. And actually, if you have a look at that hoa haere concept, there's a bit of co-governance in there. You know what I mean? We've got an equal standing. We might not see things the same. Actually, sometimes we see them very differently, but we can still coexist, and we can still have those robust conversations. So yeah, very lucky in my space. Haven't had to teach in a classroom or anything like that. I get to teach kei roto i te poho o te tupuna whare. That in itself is a comforting, safe place. So, hi, koina.
Beautiful. Creating those safe spaces with your hoa haere, exemplifying the walking the talk, and again, that leadership and creating a safe space. getting out of your environment and taking them into a marae space where you feel confident and strong and you can offer that manaakitanga that's critical. Key in that. Roni, kei a koe.
Kia ora. I'm going to respond to your request, Koka, and give an example of how we help learners think through, you know, the shared authority through in the classroom as a part of our teaching approach. But I just want to talk first about the hoa haere element, which is so cool. And I think as actual teaching strategy to always have a hoa haere, there's a couple of good things in there. One I know is, you know, about what you were talking about with grief, Rachel, like if you look over at your mate that you're teaching with and you can see, uh-oh, you know, they're having a moment, you know, then that's when they can take the lead. And I think that's really important to remember as educators. For all the work that I've done with other more senior educators, some of you know I was very privileged to do some interviews with some of our leading minds on this for my own research, but there was no consensus really. This was the funny thing. There was no consensus as to whether or not you show emotion or whether or not, you know, you hold it back. And I think the best advice I got given was from Leonie Pihama, kia ora Leonie, where she just goes, you know, it's how you feel. If you feel safe to show that, you know, then show that, that she would go, oh, taihua, like if ever she could feel something, you know, and then that's when it's good, you know, for then your hoa haere to be able to come in. And I love that both what you and Jarrod were talking about in terms of the giving of the different perspective as well. That's amazing. Now, it's this idea of different perspectives, Koka, that I really wanted to explore as an example of a teaching a strategy. And one of them, whānau, is just pulling upon what these other three are talking about, is that, you know, that's sort of a given. It can be really emotional, you know, it can be really anxiety inducing. And what we know is that in order for learning to actually occur, we somehow have to help loosen up all the tension that any students might have. Like, that's exactly right, Jarrod. I can only imagine, you know, they've never even been in a marae and you're about to smash them with Te Tiriti kōrero. And so it's actually really something that's key in our mind, like how is it that we can loosen things up. And also because anyone, as Māori educators, we all know that this is about the mauri, making sure that the mauri is able to flow and that the kōrero is able to flow. And in addition to having karakia and having mihi and whakawhanaungatanga, etc., another thing that I love of our group Te Tiriti educators is how we will specifically have role play activities. You know, so whānau, anyone who's listening up, you know, any group activity, any role play that you can incorporate as an activity on any Te Tiriti topic, we just highly recommend. And you know, and there's a couple of things in there. One is that hilarity, you know, hilarity is absolutely fine. I kid you not, you three, I'm thinking of introducing props. Just been thinking about it recently, and shout out to Tina Ngata, who was showing me her props for doctrine game that she has. But I've actually been thinking about with our role play activity. So everyone, one of our role play activities is after we've taken our learners through a really quite intense history leading up to Te Tiriti, what we do is that we then get them into groups and where they have to have a debate. And so one is, you know, a rangatira who are against the signing, one a rangatira for. We also then have British Crown. We also then have the land speculators, the missionaries. We have Pākehā Māori. If you don't know what Pākehā Māori is, email Rhonda after. She'll be able to tell you all about it, but a key part of our history. And what we do is that they then have to debate from their particular perspective. And the key thing, whānau, the secret in this magic is that groups don't get to choose where they get into. You know, like the individual is allocated their group, they don't get to choose. And so what I've found is that, I don't know about you three, but what I've found is that some people that you could see were a little bit resistant, you know, a little bit resistant. If they happen to end up in the group where they're advocating against signing a tiriti because they're like, you know, we already have our mana, we already have our whakaputanga, I don't want to cut off any of our other mates, you know, Britain, this is a red flag that they're getting too possessive, you know, in terms of our friendship. And so that is often sometimes the thing that can then switch them. Then they're completely open, you know, completely open because they've had to stand, have a time thinking about and then actually having to argue a particular perspective. And so, you know, really, really going there whānau in terms of letting that creativity flow by taking on this identity. Of course, there's some tensions in there. For example, if it's Pākehā who are pretending to be rangatira. But I think within the safety of the classroom and a closed activity, you know, it's something that's fine. The other thing that I was just going to, another role play example is where you are a word, you are a provision in Te Tiriti, and we break them up into groups, and then you have to explain, you know, like where you're from, as in where you're from in the Te Tiriti text, you know, why you are there, so the whakapapa of your presence there, but also you have to debate about why you're the most important one. And so the last thing is that I find that that wairua whakataetai, or that competitive spirit whānau, even people that are sort of holding back and thinking, oh, I'm not going to get involved in this, I don't believe in Te Tiriti. Next minute, they're the most hard out ones. They're debating with the most hilarious arguments. So I think anything kuka that can sort of get the modi stirring up and get it excited and flowing helps really relieve some of the tensions around those bigger issues, such as Mātiki mai. Yeah.
I think just and from my own perspective too, thanks Ronnie, it's great because it reminds me that those energy shifts are really important, especially when we do take those dives, when there are moments when even the learners are experiencing grief, because understanding whānau that sometimes learners come with their own experiences of impacts of colonisation, where their own parents and grandparents and tupuna have also been affected. So when they're going through our lessons and learning about the history here, they're starting to react to that as well, and they're starting to revisit their own trauma and things like that from their past. So I think having those sorts of activities help break the mood, help change the balance in the room and shift the energy. Sometimes we'll do visioning to break some of the grief spaces and regrounding people. Some of the work that that Louise and Rebecca have been teaching is really around grounding yourself and standing with your feet on the ground, retouching papa tuanuku when you can, getting outside, breathing light. So we do try all those sorts of things too in terms of being effective and helping things to move and flow. All right, look, I see that we are only on question 2, so I'm quickly going to go to question 3 because it's really important before we maybe take a break. I think we'll need to. In this work, Rachel, Jarrod, Ronnie, in your work, how do we create and grow change agents, i.e. how do we build allies and how do we support our own to become change agents as well? Māori. Kia ora, Rachel.
Kia ora. I think Ronnie really encapsulates that with one of the foundations of Te Atakura is the, teach with aroha, teach with manaaki. Like if I came into the room and I was if I was grumpy or had a kaupapa of wanting to really be gnarly, it wouldn't bring people into the same space as me. It would isolate it, would separate. And that's not natural. That's not a natural way. Someone in the chat before said, be genuine. And that really is the only way I can be. So how can I create a space where I'm engaging the learners, bringing them on a journey? It really is a journey, and especially in our 3-year degree, we have year 1 and we do this kaupapa of Te Tiriti history, and then we go into year 2 in a noho marae experience, and then we weave it in different ways into year 3, what Te Tiriti or what mana tangata whenua role is in Aotearoa. So we do have the luxury of the real journey. And I think one of our recent graduates, as in just a few weeks ago, when she came into our pre-grad kōrero, her dad stood up and said, actually, she didn't just learn the coursework and the Te Tiriti work for herself. She took us on a journey. And that actually was, a bit of a tear bringer on, because it was such a beautiful kōrero to actually hear about from the person that got brought on the journey. So that's our, I don't know, to me, that's like the epitome of what we need what I like to hear. And we don't always hear the outcomes from our learners when they go off and graduate, but it's the little things like hearing that the pepeha that they used was relevant. That's a change agent process, because by them having the confidence to do a pepeha in a different space, not our tertiary teaching space, they might not even know who else they're influencing to go back home and find out what their whakapapa is and what that means to them. So I really, for me in this role and for the hohaere I teach with, it's that genuine authenticness and encouragement, and seeing the spark in the eye of the learner that is like, oh, right, well, now I know this. I can't not know it. So what am I going to do with this information? And just keeping that relationship of learning being exciting, even if it's uncomfortable. Yeah. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thank you, Rachel. Jarrod, he hau whakaaro. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, kaupapa, pretty hard to top there, Rachel, that one for sure. But I think people, if they're going to come to your workshop, they're curious, so you want to feed the curiosity in them, and for them to be a change agent, that's the goal. We want to be shifting mindsets, and I think there's a piece in there where people have to address some of the myths I've been brought up on. They have to address some of the prejudices that they have. And, probably also, which is a real tough one, is to acknowledge their privilege. I have a privilege because I'm a man, and I'm also a tall man who can speak a little bit of te reo. So that's a privilege. But, a lot of people don't want to address the privilege. When you can address your privilege, well, then you can start seeing the world with a bit of a different lens. In my space, we work with some pretty dyed-in-the-wool, pretty hearty sort of people that have some pretty set views on Māori, but we've had some really big shifts in mindset, especially around social equity and things like that. So, people that before would just go, whatever, that's a load of rubbish, everyone's equal, everyone has the same opportunity. All of a sudden now they're our biggest advocates in Māori development. They're championing te reo. They're having, one said to me the other day, says, I've had to have a conversation to my friends and say, man, you shouldn't be talking about Māori like that when they're not in the room. So, those are pretty big statements for people to be sharing with you, but also that they're shifting that much that they're able to have those conversations with friends. So, yeah, the goal is to get those change agents. I don't do big affirmations at the end of it. I'm going to go and change the world. What I say to people is, what can you do tomorrow? What can you do when you leave here? You can start by pronouncing your workers' names correctly. That'll be a good start. Your street name, te mea, te mea, te mea. So, small bites to eat the elephant. But I know that we're getting close to 4:30, and I know Ronnie's got way more than 2 or 3 minutes. So I'll chuck that up, however.
Kapai, thanks, Jarrod. That last part around conscientisation must have action as well. So moving from being aware and understanding to actually putting it into action is really key. I just wanted to add one thing, Ronnie, while I've got the mic, is really around positionality. So one of the things that I've certainly learned to incorporate is understanding, putting yourself on the line so that your learners can see who you are, all of you. If you have Pākehā whakapapa, your heritage is from Ireland, Wales, then add that in, because you're growing trust, you're growing a bit of depth around yourself. And also, if you know your tupuna or your ancestors' role in Te Tiriti and where they joined the conversation, then it's helpful to use that, bring that in, that kōrero, because it feeds a curiosity among learners around, I wonder what my tupuna were doing when they arrived here, or what boat brought them here, where they stayed first. It's that sense of curiosity. Heoi, kia koe, Ronnie.
Kia ora tātou, absolutely. I love that. So in terms of creating change agents, be that tangata whenua or growing allies, certainly that like having some ki kawa in terms of how you engage with everyone. Just to reflect on Rachel's kōrero first, because that is about one of the things that we say is that, we don't have to go out and try and hurt people because the information hurts enough. The information hurts enough, and we know that this is one of the changes in Te Tiriti education. And, just to be honest, we still sometimes get some criticisms from people that go, oh, you're too soft. And what we just say is just wait, because we know what's coming. We know what's coming in terms of the period of time where we have to talk about, this oppression of settler colonialism. And so I think that aroha thing is really important. The other thing as well, just to reflect on then what Jarrod says, is this is exactly right, is that, Kuka, what you're saying about positionality, with ourselves, and then also getting our learners to reflect on that, because we say, hey, we're not asking you to go out and change the whole world. I mean, really, we are secretly, but what we say is that, you don't need to go and change the whole world. What are you going to do Monday? What are you going to do Monday? We say Monday because most of the workshops, we run on Thursday, Fridays, but what are you going to do Monday? And also, for those of you that know our work, we literally even have an implementation sheet where we have, right, these are the provisions of Te Tiriti, these are some, appropriate current day expressions. For example, if we know in 1840, tino rangatiratanga independence, a really important facet of that these days might be self-determination, or whatever you want to call it. What are you doing to support that action on Monday? And it actually gets people into an urgent place where they're like, right, what am I going to do? One, it lets people know we're for real. If we're engaging with you in a tiriti wānanga, be it a day or 2 days or over some time, there is mutual expectation that this is for conscientisation purposes, that this is to, raise awareness and deepen understanding, but for action. And so I think even without ever having to say that explicitly, the part of the change agent happens naturally when people realise, that this is something we actually care about. We expect you to do something. So if there's any time that we do apply any pressure to learners, it's on this, is that the expectation that you will do something. I've literally even started saying, look, whānau, te tiriti's like te reo. If you have some knowledge of it, you've got to share it. You've got to practice it every day. We've got to literally, because, I don't know how that came about, but, it's just a good way to think about it. Like, go and share this with others. And I think as well, having time, even if you've only got a shorter time period, whānau, trying to incorporate some time where people go, right, what does this mean for me actually on Monday, or actually every day? This might be in their role at work, or their role in their community, or in their whānau, but actually having some time there where people there have to have a look at it. They don't have to come up with an entire strategy, and we joke to them about, we're not going to submit this to your boss, etc. But it's so that they then even have some little actions that they can take, immediately, that they have the power to. Because what we know is that one of the key ways that people sort of opt out once they learn the big Te Tiriti story, or even just have some kōrero, is that they go, oh, one, this is between the Crown and Māori, or one, this is between the Crown and iwi. Hopefully we've got them to talking about hapu, or, and they can easily distance themselves from it. And so what I like in terms of the one pressure that we do apply is that we don't let people do that. We don't let people escape. We don't give them permission to say, there's nothing, that I can do. That includes as well as, oh, well, this is how my whole organisation needs to change. And this is how my whole, it's too oppressive. We go, oh, yeah, I know. But so what can you do? And all the things, just so that they have some really clear ideas. And as you will know, part of our workshop is having confidence as to what Te Tiriti means. So it's up to them. That's the other thing, is that we don't come in and go, right, this is how you're meant to be honouring Te Tiriti. Brr. Our workshops are focused literally on capability building, where it's growing their own knowledge, and then they have the responsibility. And I think that's a key part of it, is that if people have the responsibility of coming up with their own ideas, then they are 100% more likely to then actually trial them. Yes, I don't know if that's us tricking people into doing it, but I do really enjoy that part of our mahi. Yeah.
Ka pai.
Tino tangata tiriti.
Tika. So you're getting all the tricks and the back of house insights here, whānau. I think it gives you a really good idea around how complex it can be, just thinking through all the possible scenarios. Look, we were going to take a break about now, but I just want to lean into one of the questions that's popped up before we do that and give our panel an opportunity to respond to it. It's around how you get a group to talk about things like Mātiki Mai when the group is still struggling with Article 2. So it could be anything, not just Mātiki Mai, but how do you judge their readiness? So again, that's from Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. When they're already struggling with Article 1, Article 2, how do you talk about it and that transformation and constitution, etc.?
Beautiful. Great question. Go, Rach.
I think it's really about taking the time with Article 2 and really understanding, like how can we see what taonga means? Because if we can articulate that taonga is tangible, intangible, it's the reo, it's the wairua, it's knowing not what rongo is, because I know what kawakawa is, but there's so much more out there. But knowing some of the kupu and how we so I'm thinking of Mātiki Mai in the sense of, do they need to know what Mātiki Mai is if they're doing Article 2 at this point? Or is that something that they could come back to? Or is it enough to know that knowing that taonga can be seen differently by two different parties, but if we go back to our original peoples here, how do we see taonga? And then maybe Mātiki Mai can start to be connected in that sense. We understand things when they are relevant to us. So if our environment is our taonga, and Mātiki Mai then can be seen, and how are we looking after that environment? We can then see how Koro Taranaki has been given personhood, how the Waikato Awa has been given personhood. So it relates back to that concept in that article. Kia ora.
Beautiful. Kia ora, Rach. Just want to know if Jarrod and or Ronnie want to add on to that at all?
Hi, Jarrod.
I'll defer to Ronnie on this one.
Oh, naughty. You're not going to do that next time. Okay. Right, whānau, just to total Rachel's thing, absolutely love that in terms of, what's a real thing that we can connect it to. But also I think, and I think as well that, and even then in the kāwanatanga sphere, and I know that these are things that people shout out to Erin Matariki Kā and who work around Mātiki Mai Aotearoa, is then even just when we're exploring kāwanatanga and tino rangatiratanga, one of the things that she always points out with kāwanatanga is that, hey, look, in the world they're talking about the need to transform kāwanatanga. Kāwanatanga as it's worked out in terms of colonial governments isn't working out for anyone in terms of, capitalist, exploitive colonial governments. And so, bringing in some of that global context in the different movements, to get changes, and then in the Indigenous context where then they have actually had changes, and then go and here we just call that Mātiki Mai, because this is one of the things that's important to us. Is always that context, is that we have that history context in terms of well, actually this is something that our tipuna have already have always tried, have always been discussing right from the beginning. But then if people are still struggling with that context, the notion of tino rangatiratanga Māori rights, it's then taking it into that global area and saying, well, actually all over the world people are doing this, have been doing this, here it just happens to be called that, and that we have a really beautiful opportunity here in Aotearoa to establish an honourable kāwanatanga that lives in balance and harmony with the values of it's tangata whenua, because we have Te Tiriti, so it's really even then how Te Tiriti feeds into Mātiki Mai, but as well as being the foundation for the agreement, but it's that it's that source of where where these future relationships lie. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I know all Claire Charters whānau, Professor Claire Charters as well, has been doing a lot of work on what are some examples from overseas. But I like that question, and thank you, Catherine, because what you're raising is the hook. What is the hook? You know, or what is how is it that you draw people in? And so sometimes, our wānanga can be all over the place because I'm just trying anything under the sun, you know, like what's the hook these people need? There's always something whānau, there's always something, depending on what people's interests are, but it's an important one. An important one. But I would honestly say never too early to introduce Mātiki Mai though. It's not like, there is some stuff that, as you know, in our squad, we try and carefully introduce, and what we mean is white supremacy. That's something that we try and carefully introduce only because of the danger it has for switching people off. I, however, though, do not feel the same way about Mātiki Mai. I think that a future that's more balanced in terms of relationships, because it's those local relationships that you're talking about, I don't think that that's a dangerous topic. It can be difficult, but it's just how it's managed. But I wouldn't say too early to introduce, not really. Hey, what do you reckon, Rhonda?
I was just going to add, thanks for that, Ronnie. That's great. In a practical sense, though, sometimes we'll park a question and say that's actually going to be picked up tomorrow because it wouldn't make sense in the timing of the workshop to introduce it too soon, and we might give too much away. We want to keep them curious. That's part of that hook too, eh? Part of that hook is keep them curious, make sure they're ready for it and they're anticipating jumping into it on day 2 or whenever you've decided that'd be the best place to put it in there. But I like the fact that that you say, really, we don't want to back away from them. We do want people to start thinking about Mātiki Mai. It is still so relevant today. It's still so appropriate for us to have these conversations and revisit all those values that not only sit under Te Tiriti, but came back to us in, all the hundreds of hui that you ran in Mātiki Mai and those interviews that you did. You and Mona and others. Look, whānau, thank you so much. Thank you, panel. We are going to take that 5-minute break. I don't know about you, but I'll need to stand up for a wee while. While we're away, there'll be some delightful music that we're going to be entertained by. 5 minutes, go and have a drink of water and come back and join us then. Kia ora tātou. Hope you've all had a bit of a water break. Thank you for that music, Ray. Ka pai. Just while we're waiting for Jarrod to come back to the panel, if you've got any questions, please don't forget to throw them into the Q&A function down on the bottom of your screen. Certainly enjoying, I had a chance to read through some of the chat and the conversations in the ka pai koutou.
Kia ora, Rhonda. Hey,
All
here we
good.
go.
Kia ora, Jarrod.
Here we are.
Hey, so I just wanted to revisit with you all, and because I sort of kicked it off a little bit earlier, about half an hour ago, I just wanted to revisit the approach of positionality and really wanting to know how each of you use positionality to inform your own teaching practice. So if I can just throw it back to you, maybe I'll start with you this time, Jarrod, and then go to Rachel.
Thanks. That's what I get for being last back on the call, eh? I think it was touched on earlier before. Ronnie had said that it's really important to bring your whole self to your practice. I always use whakapapa, where I whakapapa to and tell those stories so that people can locate me, but also I don't shy away from, actually I have whakapapa into Wales, Ireland, Scotland, those sorts of places as well. And one of the funny stories I tell people is actually one of my tupuna was an editor at the New Plymouth Herald, and some of the editorials he wrote were extremely racist. So they're really good for people to go, oh, this person here he's not fixed in one sort of position. He draws on all of his whakapapa. Also, acknowledging, it was spoken about before, when it's mamai, it's okay to show that it's mamai, like giving people that genuine you, if you know what I mean. So in terms of that positionality, it's bringing your whole self, bringing all of your stories with you, but also like people understanding that this is where you're located. And one of the things I have to be very cognizant of is that I'm 6'3". I'm obviously a little bit tanned and can get quite passionate. So I have to be really careful how I temper that in a classroom space, because people get switched off because they'll just go, oh, here's the big angry Māori guy, So have to be really, really careful how I present myself when we get into those stages of the conversation where things might be, some of our history gets a little bit mamai for us, so we start feeling a little bit hearty or whatever. So we'll take the breath, because your tauira aren't going to dig on you if you're going to go into a rant or be the angry guy, because actually it's not about you, it's about them. So yeah, I'm pretty sure those things, Rachel's got some time to prepare herself. She's going to talk to this way better than me. So
Kia ora, Jarrod. Ka pai. Kia koe, Rachel.
Oh, kia ora. I think I'm lucky enough to be old, Generation X. So when I started at uni, I did something called feminist theory, or Femst 101. And that was in the early 90s. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to positionality through a feminist theory lens. And it just seemed absolutely logical to me. I couldn't imagine not talking into how I was connected to Ōtepoti or not when I became a lecturer. So like for me, positionality is the whole of me. I can't actually speak to being not from this space if I'm not speaking to how I became a migrant Māori in my own country. I can't help but talk to the having no reo, or I'm learning reo, by the way. I'm very excited. I can say this is he pango, he rako pango. Anyway, but that is part of my kōrero. Who am I to talk to Te Tiriti when I can't kōrero I te reo Māori? Well, that is because of colonisation. So how do I, how can I not talk to that? And one of my mentors said something to me that has always stayed with me, and I used it in teaching to begin with. I didn't realise I was, though, and that's that Māori are truly bicultural because we are Māori and we have the other whakapapa, whatever that may be. And I found when I was teaching alone that in order to not be, I mean, I'm not tall, I'm quite poto, and I had to lean into my tawiwi whakapapa, or my Pākehā whakapapa, because I needed to connect with the learners and say, yeah, I understand this. My ancestors fought each other. I don't even know what that means for me. So leaning into that made me conscious of what positionality might look like for them and might look like for us. But also, look, I'm also lucky because I'm in a degree of the helping professions where positionality is or should be part of our kōrero with our learners every day. So yeah, leaning into who I am and what that means for me, and then transferring some of that kōrero meaning to the learners because they go out and work with other people. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora, Rachel. Very insightful. Thank you, Ronnie. Kia koe.
Yeah, kia ora kouka. And I'd love to hear your views on this too. But I think just like these other two, you know, positionality definitely. So, you know, always acknowledging not just, you know, that we're Māori whānau, but the specific, you know, lands or territories that your hapu and iwi come from, and then referring back to that throughout the teaching in terms of, well, like sometimes I say, well, I can only give you, you know, what I know from our Ngāti Porou Pakeke in the particular part of Ngāti Porou that I'm from. But also that's the power, I think, as well of the, you know, referring to your Pākehā whakapapa as well, because my grandfather, Roy, you know, was born in England. And so the things I know about England are directly from him, and able to say, you know, well, this is what my grandfather said. And that can be really important when referring to some of the more difficult aspects, and difficult, I mean, in terms of we're having to push back on those myths, you know, and able to say to people, you know, why did our Pākehā ancestors come here? I think this is important. Positionality can be used as a tool to problematize some of those things that we take for granted, because everyone knows, right, colonisation, but, you know, people saying, but yeah, but why did they come? Why did they want to come? You know, or how did that end up happening? And so being able to say, oh, you know, my Pākehā grandfather, you know, was really clear on it. And he just said, you know, darling, you know, we were starving. You know, we were starving. And so being able to pull in those threads. The other thing, Cook, that I'll just reflect on is that, you know, so there's how I use it myself, but also and my encouragement in training of others to be Te Tiriti educators. One thing that I've found only through that experience actually is, you know, how central it is, because of people, and anyone who's listening that this is the case, you know, people that feel like, oh, well, who am I to be teaching this, you know, or who am I to even be trying to discuss this with others? You know, it might be because you're Pākehā, or it might be because you are tauiwi, like a newer migrant, and people think, oh, you know, but that's the Māori story. You know, if you need to investigate why it is so important that non-Māori as well take up this work, just go and find Kōtare Trust and with Catherine Ma, just go and find the Pākehā Project with Rebecca Ma. But you know, to investigate all of that. But what I can say is that it's really only been through this broadening of our network that it's really clicked for me. Actually, this is the magic. Your positionality is your superpower. The particular, you know, place that you are coming from in terms of, you know, all the things that make up who you are. We need you to really lean in, because that's a particular perspective that we can have. And I will just mihi to a recent woman. I better not say her name until unless she's comfortable with it. But for example, she's Australian, and she was saying in one of the trainings I was giving for Te Tiriti educators, oh, you know, I felt a little bit, you know, shy and completely anxious about why I'm here. I know it's the right thing to do, but I didn't know why. And she thought that she sort of had to tone it down. And she said it's only after going through this that she's like, right, you know what, I'm even going to ham it up, you know, I'm going to like lean into this. And honestly, I've said yes, because, and then to bring all that kōrero from Australia in terms of that relationship, in terms of sometimes especially tauiwi can be so you know, helpful because their perspective is so valuable. Like I remember being told by a British woman, you know, that when she was moving here in the 70s, she was literally shown, you know, a young blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby boy rolling down a hill with a lamb. You know, that was the picture that she was given of Aotearoa. So then to come here and, of course, going straight into the 80s, Springbok tour protest, you know, land occupations, all of that. And so I said to her, yes, and because that's her particular experience, you know, I said, that's such a powerful thing to share, because here we are trying to argue, no, these myths about who we are. And so those people from that perspective can go, yeah, and I can 100% attest to that. You know, also any whānau experiences that you've had, your positionality is actually what makes, you know, who you are as a Te Tiriti educator. And so I can only encourage people to lean in on that. The last thing I'll say about that, as well as making sure that you connect to those networks, you know, for that. I was going to say, FYI, Catherine, I sent someone your way the other day, because definitely a budding Te Tiriti ally, but not sure about, you know, what was their appropriate place. And, you know, all I can say is that there are already people who've sorted that out for you. You know, they've done all the hard work over the last couple of decades figuring out what that place is. This isn't literally, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can connect to them for mentorship, etc. If you're a little bit shy about connecting with people yet, you must do that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of squad life. But also, of course, is all the writings by people like Richard Shaw, you know, writing about how he came into his positionality as a descendant of people that had inherited land, you know, that had been stolen via confiscation of Māori, you know, writing about that, and then has gone to write on other books about that experience, about the hate that he got from strengthening his positionality. So that is the unsettled whānau. Just look that up, Richard Shaw, because yeah, it's a journey, but all we can say is that, man, you won't ever regret it, you know, because Te Tiriti, if anything, you know, is one of its key facets is belonging for everyone here in Aotearoa. That requires you to know who you are, so that you can engage appropriately with others.
Kia ora. O ngā mihi koutou. I would just add that one of the key things that's really important to lean into and listen to is the mihi at the start. People get an opportunity to do, as we always do when we're on the marae or not, to introduce themselves. And as a treaty educator, really important to lean in and listen. Who's in the room with you? And then you've got to really, because for us, whakapapa is so important, right? For Māori, we need to understand who's in the room with us. Do we have obligations to them? What are our potential whakapapa links to them? And therefore, what do I know about my whakapapa that I may just need to keep quiet, or I need to raise it? So just in terms of being Māori, understanding our whakapapa well, knowing what our tipuna did, what their role was in some of the battles that they were involved in some of those inter-hapu and inter-iwi relationships, how did they fare in those, what was their role in them, knowing our own history deeply. Read about your own treaty claims in your area, read about your own kōrero, talk to your pakeke, to your kaumātua, and understand yourself more before you go in there, because as a treaty educator, you will sometimes be in the room with some people who you know your tipuna fought with. They fought with their tipuna, lost lands, lost lives. We need to understand that ourselves before we put ourselves in the room. And if you don't know that kōrero, then you just need to go in there and be very consciously aware of your gaps and the need to fill those in. We share a mentor called Mariana Pittman, and she's very strong on really understanding your positionality, understanding your whakapapa, and learning your own history really, really well before you put yourself in a room that might become fairly awkward fairly quickly. Okay, all right, whānau, that was great. Thank you very much. I just want to quickly go to a question that's popped up in the Q&A around how you deal with inappropriate comments, either in the workplace or in the workshop or with peers or colleagues, while you're maintaining a positive relationship and still trying to educate at the same time. So I'd like to ask Rachel if you could fill us in with some of your pearls of wisdom, please.
Kia ora. It's a tricky one. Yep, thanks. Positive, well, I think I really have to acknowledge my perimenopausal self here, because prior to that, I probably would just want to shrink away. If I answer it, you know, how's that going to impact my ongoing relationship with the person? And fully in perimenopause now, I might still shy away from answering or changing the conversation, because part of me is like, is this a battle I need to have right now? Am I going into a classroom to teach after this? How is it almost like a wairua protection? How is it going to impact me? Is it an education question? Or, is the comment because I know that they know that, that te. So, but if things are in a good space, then maybe I might respond and think about, what's behind that question. Oh, that's an interesting perspective. Where does that come from? What's your positionality, without asking them what their positionality is. I think the older I get, or the more menopausal I am, I really know that I need to be thinking, what's next? And is this a kōrero that I need to lean into? And is it going to make a difference? Or is it just going to upset me? And that's the difference. Yeah, because that I have been in this space where I've been upset, and it just plays on your mind because someone's saying something that feels like you've just been teaching for 3 hours and it has cancelled all that good stuff out. Yeah. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Rachel. Jarrod, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a bit the same as Rachel there. It's sort of like the first, if it's in a workshop, your responsibilities to the other learners, and I don't really avoid confrontation at all. So it's actually, back up the bus there, bro, take it easy. But it's actually just taking a pause. An awkward pause is a really great tool to use, because it puts the onus back on the person that's delivered that awkward statement or whatever. And you say, oh, well, that's interesting. Pause. And then, how did you come up with that? And if it looks like it's going to be prickly, I'll just do hey, we should break now for 10 minutes. Let's get a cup of tea, blah, 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 and take that conversation offline and just remind that person about some of your tikanga in the hui, and just go, hey, you probably embarrassed a few people in there. Like, this is not really where we want the conversation to go. I can pick it up with you later. So that's one way to protect your learners and protect your wānanga. When it comes to the workplace, and I'm in a construction background, I'm a carpenter by trade, so you hear lots and lots of comments, but I think there's a bit of personal responsibility in there. I used to let things slide, but then I realized, no, you once you've set a standard, the standard you walk past, a standard you set. But what I found myself doing was, if people were going to make an inappropriate comment about Māori, I'd jump all over it. Right, that's inappropriate. But then it was like, now it's about women. Now it's about our rainbow community. So all of a sudden you have to check yourself and go, actually, I have to start being really consistent here. All your organizations don't put up with that language. So you should be using your practices in your organization to stamp that out, because if you let it slide, then everyone thinks, it's okay with them. You know what I mean? So, yeah. But in terms of the wānanga, the awkward pause, let's take this offline. We'll have a kōrero about it later. And that's sort of my rotaki, but yeah.
Nice. Ka pai, thank you, Jarrod. Ronnie.
Kia ora. So I firstly just want to, mihi to what's been shared. And, this has been one of the huge, challenges that I've enjoyed. Obviously you don't enjoy it at the time, whānau, but I'm really enjoyed as I've gotten older, learning to master my response. I grew up in a Baha'i community, which is really hyper diverse, and so I didn't realize, of course, until I was older, but I had sort of a zero tolerance for racism. And so I know when I became an adult and started experiencing racist comments about myself or others, I would go into this real frozen thing where I remember I just used to freeze and really not know how to respond, because I was so shocked. If you're not used to racism, just become a Te Tiriti educated whānau, then you hear everything under the sun. And and now, after all our experiences, there's two things I want to talk about with that, and that's with regards to this notion of the flip. So the first way, the flip sort of represents my view on it overall as well. because beforehand, you know, and everyone thinks this with its inappropriate comments, but any type of conflict is that people feel like they're really, you know, sort of cornered, and oh no, this is this is a situation where there's going to be an argument. Or whānau, you know, anytime anyone makes comments like that now, I just see it like as the biggest opportunity, you know, and however you happen to be feeling that day, you know, if it's like, oh my, look at this fly that's just landed in my web, you know, aren't they ready for this situation, you know? So you can either think that totally relies on your energy, whānau, but if you're feeling a little bit energetic, you're like, oh my, you know, thank you for bringing this up. I was wondering when someone was going to bring it up, just so that you can address it. That's first thing. And I really do encourage that, whānau, you know, is to flip that and know it's not about you. It's not a personal attack on you. You know, it's just that we know that because of things like white privilege, people feel that they just have, you know, license to say the most awful things and ask the most awful things, and that, you know, that all the attention should go on answering that question, etc. But do see it like that, you know, that it's just an opportunity for you to engage in a intellectual heart, you know, soul exercise. Second thing, though, with regards to the flip, and this is in terms of how to respond. I really encourage this, is that, you know, often those questions are loaded from a particular worldview, but that person is not aware of that worldview. And so what we've been practicing in Te Atakura is where you flip it so that you make people consciously aware of their worldview without saying, well, did you know that's actually, you know, that idea comes from ABC, you know, and we've even been thinking about writing down some examples, but it's things like this. You know, when people, you know, I come from a te reo Māori speaking whānau, we only speak te reo to our children, all our children, nieces and nephews, and etc. And, you know, so you often hear people go like, oh, you know, why can't we just speak all one language? You know, why can't we all just speak the same language, for example? And so the flip on that is that I will go, and you would have heard me say this, and I would go, oh, I totally agree, te reo. You know, te reo. Or, you know, same thing when people go, you know, because wouldn't it just be fair that we all live under the same law? And I go, oh, I know, the kawa and tikanga of places is just so beautiful. You know, like I definitely agree with that. And people, and of course, this is where you get the look like where they're looking, you know, people looking at you like you're some sort of alien, you know, from a different planet. And it's like, no, I'm here from Aotearoa. I'm a native, you know, I'm a native to these lands, you know, and that is my worldview. So yes, when you say laws, and yes, when you say language, and what you're doing, is that you are flipping the script in terms of bringing into their consciousness, you know, like, oh, right, I'm coming from a particular, you know, where they call it worldview or perspective, etc. And for this person, that's the opposite of their norm. You know, they're coming from somewhere completely different. And so it can help in terms of that, but also because you're agreeing with them, because you're going, oh, I totally agree. Te reo is such a beautiful language, you know, and this is the only place where it exists in the entire world. So I totally agree. We should all be speaking it. Yeah. And because you're disarming them as well with agreeing, but with a flip, people are then like, you know, they're not quite sure how to respond. And so, yeah, I get heaps of awkward silences from them, you know, from them. But, you know, just one suggestion, whānau, but it's a funny one. Yeah, it's a funny one.
Great tools. Great tools. Thank you all. This one's kind of a nice build on what we've been discussing already, but how is this education specifically decolonising? Rachel, aroha mai.
Yeah, kia ora. Specifically decolonising. Well, it is in its nature changing a perspective of the dominant culture to Indigenous people's perspectives. I guess going back to that word or the concept, and that's part of it. The kōrero around what is taonga cannot be understood as a translation. So even to start to understand, and another kōrero that I talk into is what is wairua. It's not a translation of spirituality. It's how we connect to that feeling of whatever it is. And I do find myself referring to favorites. What is your favorite song? The one that brings shivers down your spine when you're hearing it and you know the words and you're back in that magic of that moment. You know, that's giving giving a name to a concept that people can understand that doesn't have a translation attached to it, that is decolonizing. Thinking of even having two people in the room in a tertiary education space is decolonizing, because it's not a commonality. It's certainly not in our space to have two people in a room giving time and space and place to the importance of the mahi. So yeah, I could talk for ages, but I do know that kia ora, your turn, someone else.
Kia ora, thank you. Jarrod?
Yeah, I think in terms of that decolonising behaviour, I just reflect on the whole wānanga space that we facilitate in. So we have a hoa haere, you have a duality there. I always have a kaumātua with me, and that's that sort of spiritual safety net. If anyone feels a bit wanga or mamai, they can go talk to them. Also in terms of pedagogy, so in the wānanga space, it's not so much master servants. Like I would die if I had to stand there for an hour and just preach, and everyone sat there writing notes. It's an interactive process, and just building on Ronnie's conversation around mihi. That's a decolonising process, because what we're doing is we're asking people not who you are, or not what you are, who you are, where you're from. And you can use that in your wānanga further on. And we've had I've had some real gems with that when I've gone, oh, actually, this is from your area. Have you ever heard about the story before? And then they go, oh, actually, I had a friend, or I understand that. And all of a sudden, there's this richness to the kōrero. So, the practices that we undertake as Māori that are very, very different to a Western style of education. So for me, there's this teaching with manaakitanga and with aroha. There's the wānanga, atu and mai, wānanga nanga kōrero, whakawhiti kōrero, whakawhiti whakaaro. And the last bit of that pedagogy is the ability to reflect. So, it's like people often say to me, oh, what are we doing for the next 10 minutes? I'm like, I don't know, lay on your mattress. Go and talk to somebody. We'll get back into it later on. And it just gives people time to process everything. I think in a Western education sort of a system, it's going, oh, you got another 10 minutes, you better ram 10 more minutes of information down their throats. It's like, no, just go and have a lie down, or go and have a talk, go and have a walk, go outside, process what I've talked to you about, and we can come back later. And the last piece is, at the end of your wānanga, you do the like mihi again, to close off the kōrero, and it's like, share with each other, what resonated with you today or whatever, and you start getting these big shifts in people. For people that have never been in a wānanga space, it's quite liberating. They're like, oh my gosh, that's not what I expected. So for me, just exposing our learners to the Māori world is decolonising enough, because if you can give them a glimpse into our world and show them its beauty, warts and all, but we're quite beautiful people, all of a sudden they have this understanding, like, oh, actually we're not all the same, and actually the way Māori roll is actually pretty cool. And so for me it's that sort of bit, what is it, to steal a mantra from a big Western nation? It's like winning the hearts and minds of the people. So cheesy line.
Kia ora. Lots in there. Thank you. Ronnie?
Yeah, ka pai. Okay. These two have spoken about, the pedagogy, or the how, and the teaching and learning. And I also just wanted to point out that about curricula, what it is that you teach as well. Because one thing whānau, and I think you've just mentioned this now, Catherine, in the chat, is that, Te Tiriti education is not itself decolonising, because if you stand up and you say, right, Cook landed, etc., he discovered Aotearoa, and that's where your timeline starts, and that's how you're starting it, then that's actually perpetuating the colonial myth, and it's knowing that decolonising is actually, taking people through where they can, see the lies, in those myths and are able to reject them. And so that's just one little example there, from Cook, but that there are many, many things. I know that, one of the main ones we get is the idea that, Māori signed a treaty because we needed protection from, the lawless settlers, and we needed protection from the French, and we needed protection from ourselves, etc., etc. And, I feel aroha for some Tiriti educators when that's the information and the evidence that we have, that they had at the time. But of course, we're so blessed in terms of everything that hapu and we have shared through the tribunal process, as well as those of us that have had those stories passed down to us. In terms of kōrero tuku iho, is that it's really important that we are able to give, an actual view of, well, this is actually the truth in terms of where we are and from the people we are, so that then it's that process of people being able to see, oh yeah, actually those things are myths that we have been told to uphold, and unequal power relations, or the constitutional structures that we currently have, or, the current oppression that Māori have in terms of being able to exercise our mana, our rangatiratanga. And so really having a closer look at what that, what it is that you're teaching, I think is really key. One other thing, Whānau, that I just want to say with regards to the decolonising aspect is that also then in terms of your pedagogy, it's really important, like what Jarrod and Rachel both saying, in terms of that's how positionality comes into it, because you bring your learners in, like, well, what have you heard, or what have you learned? And it's not to put them on the spot, but it's for them to be able to share. But even the way that you phrase it in terms of pedagogy, that you're not blaming for someone, you're not saying, well, what do you believe? Or what is it that you know? One of the things that you're saying is, what have you heard? Or what have you read? Because then that locates, that locates the information as coming from somewhere, coming from a source, which then gives people permission to let that go. So in terms of those just little tips and tricks that you can use, as opposed to saying to someone, oh, well, what you believe is actually wrong, it helps people take a more critical view as to what it is that they currently know from whatever sources that might be, and then that is what actually opens up and enables, a decolonising process to happen. It's again loosening it up, like loosening up the Māori, so that then it can flow. Anything that's stuck there in the Māori, letting that flow. So that's just one little trick.
Awesome. I think too, just it's building on that space of trust and making sure that people know that what is shared is in confidence, that you're holding that space for conversations to happen honestly, and that you treat it with respect. Ka pai. Thank you. Okay, I think we've got time for probably one last question, and it is specifically around whether you would caucus or not. To caucus or not to caucus. I'll let you each handle that however you want, and to explain what we mean by that too. Thank you.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Caucusing is fantastic. As I related earlier, that's how I didn't know it was called caucusing at the time. I thought it was just a Māori group and a Pākehā group. But I did notice, and I really clearly remember, the other group felt like they were missing out. That was one of the kōrero that came through. So I think I remembered that. So for me, it was like, how can I get, is it replicable? Can I do in a classroom or with adults? So need to be specific here. Tertiary education, can I replicate? Was that just lucky that I had that experience? So when I'm just one person in the room teaching, it was not, I couldn't do it. So it was with my hoa haere that we both trusted each other enough to hold the separate spaces of caucusing. So, but one of the beautiful things recently was, okay, so now we've got a whole bunch of learners, and some of them are tauiwi and some of them are mana moana. So we need more people in the room. That's what happened. So how do we caucus with larger groups? And I'm all for it, as long as there's enough space for each lot of people to reflect in their own way, and a kōrero about whether or not you come together and reflect, or whether you hold that kōrero in those groups. And definitely around that kind of kōrero, how do you make sure that the groups understand that they don't have to go and talk to the other group about what they discussed, and it's okay to not know? So that means there's got to be a whole lot of trust. So it might look different in different environments. I'm in a teaching environment. The learners are in a learning environment. They know that's part of the deal, the kaupapa. Yeah. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Jarrod, your reflections, please. I know you shared a little bit about this before, but if you can just shed some insights, what do you think?
Yeah. Really different space for us, because obviously we don't have, tangata whenua and tangata tiriti or tauiwi in the same room. However, probably like to just talk a little about when we do have non-Māori, and because we're very multicultural, our organisation, is actually you start dealing with, there's two groups appear. One are recent immigrants, and the other group are people that are descended from Pākehā settlers from a long time ago. And recent immigrants, they have their own experiences of colonisation, or they bring that with them. In particular, the Irish, people from the subcontinent, India. You can actually physically see the response is different during your wānanga. You're like, oh, man, I have to take care of these people over here because it starts swelling up. And the other one, which was quite surprising, is South Africans that are categorised as coloured, because they underwent a lot of dispossession, and quite often you have to manage that. So, yeah, we don't do caucusing as such, but what we do is make sure that people are sharing those stories, that so that the rest of the participants go, oh, this isn't an isolated thing. It's not just Māori that this has happened to. This has happened in a global sort of a context, and people have come up from halfway around the world and are bringing that with them. For our Māori, it's quite interesting with Māori, because whakapapa is key, and he whakataitai ngā wā katoa. We're all very, very competitive, and I like the comment before about whakapapa being Ngāti Pro. You're very selective what hui you use your whakapapa in, for sure. But I think just to deviate a little bit away from the caucusing, but is actually the whole focus of your wānanga changes there, because it's not so much about the legislation and all of that kind of thing. It's actually about, look at the effort that your people have made to get us here, that sort of activism. We've come too far to not carry it on, making them really aware of all of that sort of sacrifice that's gone on. So, yeah, very, very interesting, the different spaces, but yeah, probably can't answer your question as succinctly as Rachel, definitely not as well as Ronnie will do.
Oh, it's very helpful. It still does offer really interesting and important insight that others will find themselves in similar situations in the future, I'm sure. Ronnie?
So all I would say is that, across those that I, have interviewed and been mentored from, this is another area where there was no consensus, really. I remember some of our people going, well, Te Tiriti was about bringing people together. So the last thing that you'd want to do is split them apart, but then on the other hand, was really clearly a desire from educators to protect their Māori students from the racism that would occur, amongst, racist comments and reflections that would come out of non-Māori. And then more recently, of course, is all the work being done by places like Kōtari and the Pākehā Project, where, Pākehā can get in the room and spill out all the things, you know, in a place where then that's not going to be harmful for Māori, but then can then be processed through. So I'm a big fan of both approaches, actually, that there, you know, is definitely a time where it's absolutely necessary to caucus, and then times where there have been, you know, where it's where you might come together. And all I will say is offer a reflection, and that is that so we don't caucus in terms of group work in the workshops that we run, but we do run workshops only for Māori. You know, so we offer, you know, we offer wānanga for everyone, but every now and then we will run a wānanga where it's just Māori, and this might be a marae, you know, or this might be a Māori caucus already within an entity. And what I can 100% say from those experiences is that those workshops are different. You know, those workshops are really different, because what we know is that Māori, you know, like other New Zealanders, having all been through the same education system, that we might not know the dates and names, etc., but we embody that history. You know, whether we know it consciously or things like that. And so what I find is that some things, like what we were discussing before in terms of explaining what kāwanatanga was, you know, and tino rangatiratanga, those parts you can move through very quickly, you know, because there's no inherent resistance against that. Not always, of course, but I can say this in the majority of our experiences. And then what I'm also finding is that tauiwi, in terms of newer migrants, yeah, brother Jarrod, yeah, 100%. I often find them to be hard case, because what happens is that, you know, when they come from a context where there has been, you know, a colonial dynamic, what people will often say is that, you know, by morning tea, they're going, I see what's happened here. You know, they might be completely new to Te Tiriti kōrero, but they can click in really easy because of, you know, the context that they have come from. Again, that's not 100%, you know, generic across the board. But I find that there are, you know, that there are different opportunities with different groups in terms of the teaching approach that you might take, in terms of the different things that need addressing. We know with Pākehā, it's all those things around, you know, positionality, identity, belonging, and also then, you know, the paralysis, you know, the Pākehā paralysis that people like Alex Barnes have looked into, in terms of wanting to do something but being absolutely petrified of offending, etc. So that's something that needs to be particularly worked through, that you wouldn't want to work through with other Māori there, because Māori, you know, are just rolling our eyes like, oh my God, can you just hurry up? You know, things are actually rather urgent in our communities. And so while you're there having your personal, you know, breakdown about whether or not this is appropriate, you know, like, you know, the rivers are burning and all of that. And so, yeah, but the thing is that, but that's an important process for Pākehā to go through, so that they're really strong when they do then present as allies. And so I would say absolutely 100% necessary, and that actually this is where Te Tiriti education is heading, you know, is that we need to get more specific. We need to get more tailored in terms of our approaches and responses, and the way that we engage, you know, different communities in this education. So, you know, big shout out to all those that are doing the work with all the different types of groups, because I do believe that this is really where it's at, yeah, in terms of the powerful responses of you know, supporting and encouraging and strengthening people's notions as a Te Tiriti change agent.
Kia ora. Thank you all. I just wanted to add a couple of things from our previous experience in the public service. It was really important to meet separately with our Māori staff, and often that gave us the opportunity. We always start in a completely different place. So we would have our different workshops, with all of our non-Māori staff and with all of our recent immigrants. All of those people would come together. Māori were not excluded from it, but they could choose to wait until we held our forum for them. But what we found was creating a safe space for everybody. And when Māori are in that group was often quite challenging, and it could still be awkward no matter what level of manaakitanga and intention and all those wonderful things we've talked about before you did. They still found it very difficult to bring their whole selves to the room and be honest in their feedback and engagement. But when we did it separately, it actually brought the magic for them. We could be very Māori, we could sing, we could break out in song, we could laugh with one another. There are jokes that we can have about our whakapapa that only we can have amongst ourselves. Secondly, I would say that this is obviously different to when you're having your own hui and learning opportunities with your own hapu and your own whānau and your own iwi, which in themselves there's lots of magic that gets unlocked there. But even still, recognizing that you start in a completely different place and a completely different spaces. Usually we're on our marae or in a home. Or in a community space, and those sort of add to the opportunity to really lean into whatever's going on in their own space. And usually you get the richness of their stories that you don't get when you're in a workspace, which is a beautiful opportunity for us all. Hey, look, don't go away, because this last question to all of our panelists is probably what you've all been waiting for, as well as all that beautiful richness you've just had, because you won't want to go without knowing some tips and advice from all three of them. So before we close out, I'd just like all three of you, please, if you could give our audience your top 3 tips or advice for new Te Tiriti educators, or even for those that are still educating, currently educating. What are your top tips, please? Take it away, Rachel.
Kia ora. Great resources, great mentoring, and space for reflection. Resources are really key, and I was on one of the watching one of the talks earlier this week, and I was like, oh man, I love what they're saying. What resources do they have? So, just making sure that we've got a diversity of resources as well. So making sure that we're thinking of our differently abled whanaunga, what kind of resources are there. I don't think there's many for blind or deaf accessible needs to be met, but also films, Moodoo, Orphans and Kingdoms, Uproar, those kinds of things are really good for engaging people in a way to look at what we want to talk about, what hauora is like, but not having to personalize it. Sometimes that bit's really awesome. Yeah, I could talk for ages. It's one of my favorite subjects about resources. So
Aroha mai, but the 1 minute we've got left, Jarrod, kei koe.
Don't be boring. Don't be boring. Prepare well. Make it an experience for your learners, so they go, man, that was awesome. That's my number 1 tip. And the other one is look after yourself when you're delivering, like drink water, get your energy back, because it is exhausting. So that's my top 2. I'll leave it for the star of the show, Ronnie, to round us up.
Ka pai, Jarrod. Thank you so much. Hey, Ronnie.
Bloody hell, don't say that. We're all in the same constellation, brother. We are. That's good of life. Right, 3 things. First thing, we've already discussed it. Think about pedagogy, the how of the teaching, not just the curricula. New Te Tiriti education are often just obsessed with the facts and the dates and things like that. How you do it's just important. Second thing is that whānau, you are not going to be able to give them everything. So we have a saying in Te Atakura educators, lifetime homework. Where we literally say to people, go do this, links to, the evidence idea, but saying to people, do this. We're just referring people constantly. There's some great resources out there, tribunal claims, people can read deed of settlements, but also where all the documentaries that people can watch about the time. Last one, absolutely, and this goes along with my mihi to my hoa haere here on our panel, is squad life whānau. Don't try and do this on your own. And we don't just mean about hoa haere. You must find a network. You must find your support group. Debriefing is the thing that keeps us sane, in these really difficult times, depending on what the government's doing. People with racist comments are either enlivened, sometimes then it dies down, but there's always going to be difficult challenges in Te Tiriti Ed. You can't do it alone if you're going to last, so go and find your people so that you can share the love, share the grief, strategize for the growth. Yeah. Thank you, Rhonda, for joining us.
Tēnā koutou. That's a beautiful way to wrap up our conversation and our discussion for the afternoon and for this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Couldn't have done this without all the volunteers that are in the background, as well as all of the partners that have helped to make this possible. There's over 35, as I understand it. Just want to make sure that you understand too, there are some other activities that are going on as well. So please check out the website and get along to some of those. And I just want to make sure that we can close off with a karakia, and we have one that we use in our squad, Te Atakura educators. Just again, that squad life stuff is so important, because there will be some highs and there will definitely be lows. So I'll just close with karakia. Haere mai te tiriti o Waitangi, haere mai ki tēnei ao, haere mai ngā hua kei roto i a koe, tū mai ki tō mātou taha, noho mai ki tō mātou taha, tākiri a nuku, tākiri a rangi, te manawa tī, te manawa tā, tēnei te kare kau, te kare a roto e, ti hei mauri ora.
Mauri ora. Mauri ora whānau.
Ka kite anō.
Mauri ora,
Bye.
kia
Ai,
ora.
te pere.
Thanks, Kaz.